when I was first coming up in the strength and conditioning world, I remember hearing about creatine for the first time and thinking, that's for the gym bros. Well, if I could go back and tell myself what I know now, I probably would have had a much different opinion on the matter. Every single week, I get questions from other women who are strength training, particularly women over 40, who want to know, does creatine have benefits for them? In other words, is creatine just a supplement for gym bros? What does the research say on this? We're going to be taking a look at that in this podcast episode. Thanks so much for being with me today on the podcast. We're going to be diving into this topic. It is a super meaty one. And it's not just about creatine in general, but what does the research and the current evidence that we have say about creatine supplementation for women? I get this question constantly. And if there is one supplement that creates a lot of questions, a lot of controversy even, or just misunderstanding, it is creatine. So on this podcast episode, we're going to be diving in to what creatine is, what are its benefits, but specifically, what do women need to know? And what does the research say about women taking creatine? Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm really excited that you're with me today because we are going to be diving into what does the current research say about creatine supplementation specifically for women. I get this question so very often, and I wanted to share with you what some of the general consensus is about creatine supplementation and women. Now, before we go any further, make sure you hit subscribe on your favorite podcast app and head over to YouTube. Hello. Ring the bell over there for more notifications and hit subscribe so you can get notified for when new videos are published on my channel. And of course, if you're an athletic woman over 40 and you're looking for strategy, coaching, and support around your fueling, your training, and your recovery, putting it all together in a cohesive package that works with your physiology instead of against it, then check out Strength Nutrition Unlocked. We would love to have a chat with you. So make sure you head over to stephgaudreau.com/apply, fill out the application, and we would love to chat with you more about potential next steps. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into this today. Creatine monohydrate is an extremely well-researched supplement. It is one of the most researched performance enhancing supplements in the world of all time and is very popular among athletic individuals, fitness enthusiasts, and the like. There are well over 500 studies done on creatine at this point, and the number I've seen can range up to even 1,000 studies, and we're still continuing to add to this body of literature all the time. When we take a look, though, at how many of these studies have been done specifically in female-only cohorts, that number does shrink down. And of course, we've talked numerous times on this podcast about how women are still underrepresented in the research with sports science and exercise science and performance nutrition. And there's definitely a long way to go. Although things seem to slowly be shifting, we absolutely need more representation in the literature. So there was a 2020 systematic review and meta-analysis that was done, and it was looking at what are some of the adverse outcomes potentially of women specifically taking creatine. And they looked at 650 total studies as kind of their pool. And from there, they were able to narrow down about 58 studies that were done on female-only cohorts, which represents less than 10% of the data, or sorry, less than 10% of the studies that were kind of pulled together in this systematic review and meta-analysis. So there's just a lot of continued misinformation, mythology, and confusion in women about creatine. Is it even useful for women? Is it something we might want to consider taking? Like, what are some of the benefits and some of the ways in which our bodies might respond differently? So that's what we're going to be tackling in this podcast today. So in this episode, we're going to look at what is creatine, what are some of the benefits, specifically benefits for women, and what do you need to know about things like dosing? So first and foremost, what is creatine and how does it work in your body? So creatine helps to improve strength and power output during high intensity activities and exercises like lifting heavy weights, sprinting, jumping, and so on. So anything that requires you to move quickly and powerfully, you can think about creatine as having some role in that. The reason is that creatine is going to combine with something in the cell called phosphate. And we're really thinking about muscle cells here, although creatine is going to be showing up in other tissues such as your brain. So what we tend to think about creatine as being associated with, though, is the muscle. So we have creatine, and then when we do these explosive types of activities, which require ATP or adenosine triphosphate, they become essentially depowered and we lose that phosphate group. And so it becomes adenosine diphosphate or ADP. So essentially it's a molecule that's missing some of its power, some of its energy potential. So what creatine does is in the cell, creatine helps to bond to phosphate groups and be ready to donate those back to ADP and make ATP. We've talked about on this podcast, for example, in the past, about why we rest in between our more power and strength-based exercises. We rest between sets. It's to help regenerate ATP as that cellular energy molecule, the energy molecule that's really associated with moving very quickly, explosively, and powerfully. Now, of course, there are multiple energy systems in our bodies, in our cells that are going to help us through exercise, depending on the type of exercise, and they do overlap. But we're really thinking about kind of the short end here of the energy and sort of exercise spectrum as where creatine and its role comes in. So it really helps us to recharge or regenerate ADP into ATP, which we can then use to do these explosive movements. So the majority of the creatine in your body is stored in skeletal muscle, and it's estimated about 95% of your creatine is found in skeletal muscle, which is the muscle that we use to do all of our exercise and move around. Of course, we also can see that creatine is in tissues like the brain, like the kidneys, and so on. So it's in smaller quantities in those other tissues. Creatine is also found in the central nervous system, for example, the brain, and may help to support neural function to the adaptations that we get from exercise. So before we go any further and you're like, oh my gosh, I've heard all these different kinds of creatine, we're really talking about creatine monohydrate here. And this is the one that is the most well studied. So if you're out looking for a creatine supplement to buy, you really want to look for creatine monohydrate. Okay. It is the most well-studied version of creatine. So there's the most evidence to back up its use. So how is creatine produced in the body, and can we get it through diet? The answer is yes, we can get it through food. Creatine is also made in the body from amino acids, mostly in the liver, but also made in the pancreas and in the kidneys in smaller quantities. So we do make creatine endogenously. That means like we are capable of making it ourselves. The problem, though, is that without supplementation, we don't maximize our creatine stores. And it's very hard to maximize our creatine stores through dietary intake alone. Creatine is found in meat and fish in more abundance. So if you consume these foods regularly, you may have slightly higher levels of creatine than someone who does not eat these foods. But even if you do eat meat and fish, it's likely that your creatine stores are not fully topped up. So that's why creatine supplementation is something that is additive to, of course, a well-rounded dietary intake of things like animal protein. If you are a vegetarian or a vegan, or you don't eat a lot of meat, then it stands to reason that you are a person who might benefit even more from creatine supplementation, because the amount that you're getting through dietary intake alone is going to be significantly lower than somebody who is regularly eating animal-based protein as part of a mixed macronutrient diet. So for example, if you're like, well, how does this work out in terms of quantities? A pound of uncooked beef or salmon provides about 1 to 2 grams of creatine, and that is not going to fully top up our creatine store. So even if you eat a pound of these proteins in your day, you're still not going to adequately or maximally top up those creatine stores. Okay, so now let's move into talking about some of the benefits of creatine, since this is probably why you're listening to this podcast episode. There is adequate data to show that creatine supplementation has benefit for athletic performance, including things like strength, lean mass, and in some cases, even endurance type of training, right? The main benefits shown throughout the research, and again, this is collectively looking at the body of research that we have so far, is increased strength and power output during strength training. Like I said, jumping, sprinting, these explosive types of activities where we had to move really fast, move with a lot of power, or maximally kind of be moving weight. There also appears to be a benefit to lean mass, and there may be some benefits to your anaerobic working capacity and even aerobic working capacity. So if we're talking more about the endurance element of your training, there is some evidence to indicate that creatine is beneficial for that. And then there are also non-athletic benefits. And this is some of the more interesting, I guess, or promising area of research that continues to develop, which is looking at improvements in cognitive performance, reducing mental fatigue, benefits to mood, and so on and so forth. So just know that even if you currently aren't training, there may be benefit to you taking creatine or exploring that for yourself in some of these other kind of mental cognitive capacities. All right, let's move into the section of the podcast where we're going to talk about what does the research and body of evidence currently say about creatine for women. Now, before I go into that, I just want to say when I say creatine for women, I don't mean a proprietary blend of ingredients along with creatine that's specifically targeted to women. I mean, like, what does the research say about, does this have benefit for women? And if you see products on the market that are creatine for women, that's just marketing. Okay. Don't fall for that stuff. Again, you want to look for creatine monohydrate. And I will say this probably 100 times in this podcast, but before you take any supplement, creatine included, even though it's generally considered safe in healthy individuals, you always want to run things by your medical team based on your own unique situation. But there is no specific women's creatine. So we don't want to fall for any products that have been included in the pink it and shrink it category, right? Where it just says for women. And so we're like, oh, that's for me, and we buy it. So let's get into some of these women's specific concerns or benefits to taking creatine. What I'm mainly going to be talking about here comes from a 2021 paper that was published in the journal Nutritionist. The lead paper author was Abby Smith Ryan, and I'm going to link this up in the show notes in case you want to take a look at it yourself. But the paper is called Creatine Supplementation in Women's Health, a Lifespan Perspective. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole study. I just want to point out some of the really interesting points or some of the points that women ask me about a lot. So a few things, first and foremost, is that females have lower endogenous creatine stores compared to males. So we have about 70 to 80% of the creatine stores without supplementation that men tend to have. So we have a lower pool, I guess, if you want to call it, of creatine stores unless we supplement. We may also tend to consume less dietary creatine. And I will add a personal note here and just say that there are so many women that I talk to who are curious about performance. Like, you want to increase muscle, you're working out, you're training, you're lifting weights, you're like lifting the heavy shit, and you are just really not down with protein, or you're just not eating a lot of animal protein. And I've talked about that in the protein series that I did on this podcast. So go back and check out those episodes. But suffice to say, if you're like, oh, I just get really busy and I tend to skip meals, or my protein intake is kind of low, that's going to have an even greater effect on your creatine stores, especially if you're not eating much animal protein, as I said in the top of the show. Women may also have differences in how creatine affects things like protein breakdown after exercise. There may be some impact in terms of hormonal fluctuations from the menstrual cycle. So there's a lot of interesting areas and I guess curiosity about how does creatine potentially differ, or creatine like homeostasis or metabolism differ in females compared to males. Now, again, there are lots of areas where more research is needed, but I'm going to be kind of pointing out what some of the main points of this review study or review paper were. So the first thing I want to mention is body composition. Oh, okay. So many women are like, I don't want to take creatine. Creatine is going to make me gain weight. And I understand that concern. Now, if you are an athlete who's competing in a weight class sport and you have a competition coming up very soon, you need to kind of be a little bit cautious about doing things like loading creatine super close to when you're going to compete and have to weigh in. Now, that is not, I would say, a majority of people listening to this podcast. Like if you're a fellow jujitsu player, if you were an Olympic weightlifter or power lifter, for example, those are two, common sports where, weight class is a concern, making weight, for example. So suffice to say, like that could be contextually important to you. But I would say that most of the people listening to this podcast are not competing in those sports. So what does the research say on changes in body weight in women? So they looked back at this 2020 meta-analysis that I referred to earlier about adverse outcomes in women, like are there any in terms of taking creatine monohydrate? And what this 2020 meta-analysis showed, at least in terms of weight gain, is that there were no significant differences in weight gain when they compared pre-supplementation weight and post-supplementation weight. Okay, so the authors stated, quote, "The reluctance among females to use creatine may be due to fear of weight gain or other adverse side effects, which are largely unfounded, particularly in women." So if you're worried that the scale is going to go up by like 10 pounds and you're not going to take creatine for that reason, again, based on the current research that we have, it doesn't appear that women are actually affected by weight changes as much as even men are, right? There's no significant difference there. So retaining water appears to be more prevalent in men and is more likely to happen when you're loading, when you're taking large dosages for short periods of time. Even so, because people will tell me, oh, I started taking creatine and the scale went up by a couple pounds. If the scale goes up, it means that your tissues are better hydrated. That is a benefit. So those of you who are, again, let's take the weight class competitors out of this conversation for now. You're like, oh, I watched the scale and I started taking creatine and oh my gosh, I freaked out because it went up by a couple pounds or something like that. It's likely a temporary effect. And it's also likely that if you switch to a slow maintenance dose, you will see less of this effect. And even if the scale does go up slightly, you're seeing that your tissues are better hydrated. Like, I don't know how else to say this than like #muscle water, which is a good thing, right? It's a good thing to have your muscles better hydrated, your cells better hydrated. Okay. So one of the other weight concerns that we hear in women is that just like they started taking creatine along with extra carbohydrate or potentially extra carbohydrate mixed with extra protein, because that is indicative in some of the literature as being beneficial. And what this review study pointed out is that in women, this might not be necessary for you to take on extra carbohydrate, for example, just to take your creatine. Now, this doesn't mean that you can just like cut your carbs. That is not what I'm saying here. But women, because we tend to have smaller body sizes, we tend to have lower basal metabolic rate compared to men. We tend to use less energy compared to men. And if you are concerned about things like energy balance, and you're already fueling well, you may not require extra calories by taking extra protein on top of like already getting adequate protein, or taking extra carbohydrate on top of being, adequately fueled. So again, I see a lot of athletic women who are not fueling well. So this may not be as much of a concern. But again, if somebody is, for example, competing in a weight class sport and they're like really kind of tightly regulating their energy intake than like solely just trying to take creatine with extra carbs to get like extra benefit doesn't seem to be as necessary in women. So just on that point, in terms of like body weight, those are some of the salient points that the review pointed out. All right, so now let's take a look at some of the sort of training benefits that you might see. And it's worth noting that this section right here, I'm going to be talking about research done in premenopausal women. Now, there are not a ton of studies in terms of like highly trained, highly physically active females in terms of short and long-term creatine supplementation and results in terms of strength and power. But in general, what the review was able to conclude is that there's substantial evidence that creatine can help increase strength and power in trained and untrained women without large effects to body weight. Again, one of the main rebuttals that I hear is like, but I heard that creatine is going to make me gain a bunch of weight. So the answer here is there are some really awesome benefits in terms of if you are strength training, for example, like why you might want to consider creatine supplementation. In terms of aerobic and anaerobic performance, there is a small effect here. So studies suggest that there may be improvements in both aerobic and anaerobic exercise performance with both short and long-term creatine supplementation. So if you do a lot of HIIT, for example, this could definitely be beneficial for you. So you could think about adding that in. All right, what about pregnancy? I hear this question a lot, or I see it more, I guess, on social media because my population of community tends to be past the age where you're childbearing. But this does come up a lot as a question, which is, what does the research say about creatine and pregnancy? And there to date have been no human studies on creatine supplementation during pregnancy. But there do appear to be data that suggest that creatine homeostasis or creatine metabolism may dramatically shift during pregnancy. So, for example, when the fetus is growing and there's an increased demand for nutrients to go that direction across the placenta, is that, creatine homeostasis in the pregnant person may shift. So what I would say here is if you're curious about this, definitely talk to your doctor if you're pregnant or postpartum. It appears that creatine supplementation, like I said, could be useful, but I just want to, out of an abundance of caution here, say, as with all supplements, definitely check with your medical team. Okay, so let's talk about post-menopause, and then we'll go into some of the stuff on creatine loading. Okay, so there's some interesting research that's done on sort of strength and training with post-menopausal women, and also creatine intake on its own without the training aspect. So research supports that creatine is effective for improving and increasing muscle mass, strength, and performance in post-menopause, most effective when combined with resistance training. So you know me, you know this podcast. We're all about you've got to strength train, especially if you're 40 and up. And if you're post-menopausal, now is the time. Like, it's not too late to include strength training in your routine and again, lifting heavy enough weights. So it appears that the benefit that you get potentially from creatine, at least in the postmenopausal crowd, is not as strong if you're just taking it on its own, rather than if you combine creatine supplementation with resistance training. So just to kind of throw in some of the points from the study here, collectively, this is a quote, collectively, these findings suggest that postmenopausal females may experience increases in muscle mass and function when consuming high dosage creatine, and that was 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for at least 7 consecutive days. Then it says, however, when combined with resistance training, the vast majority of research supports the efficacy of creatine monohydrate supplementation for improving measures of muscle accretion, right? Accumulating muscle, strength, and tasks of physical performance in postmenopausal females. So it appears that like high dosage, shorter term creatine intake may have an effect on things like muscle mass and function in postmenopausal women who are not strength training. But when you combine the intake with strength training is really where you get the most benefit. Okay. And then a lot of people will ask, but what about bone health? This is one of the areas where, again, according to this review and kind of like looking at the body of literature, now things could have changed since then. I'm not super aware of any changes that have come up, but I could be wrong. That creatine supplementation does not appear to provide benefits to bone physiology in postmenopausal women. Okay, so that doesn't mean that resistance training can't be helpful there. So what I would say is, if you're like, oh, I'm just going to take creatine and then not lift weights because I want to see if there's an impact, positive impact in bone, that's not supported by the literature. But what is supported by literature in terms of bone health and bone strength is lifting weights. So we have benefit from strength training in terms of bone health, right? In terms of bone density. It just appears that according to the current like breadth of literature on this, that creatine doesn't appear to have a meaningful effect on bone health with or without resistance training. So I would still say that creatine for postmenopausal women, even in perimenopause and that transition, has so many benefits. It's something that I would recommend you look into taking and talk to your medical team about. But there are lots of benefits besides just bone health. Okay, so that's what I would say on that one. Okay, let's take a look at some non-training benefits potentially here for women and what does the research say on this. So the first one is mood. And this is really, really interesting because depression rates are higher among females compared to males. And that prevalence seems to also coincide with hormonal shifting that occurs in whether it's the actual menstrual cycle itself or it's across the lifespan. So puberty and adolescence, with the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, with, of course, postpartum, and in perimenopause specifically. So the postulate here is that during these shifts, is that yes, estrogen and progesterone shifting may be playing a role here, but also how sensitive your brain becomes to these hormones may also play a role. And we talked about earlier, creatine having neurological benefits. So the review paper here sort of was talking about that there's strong evidence to support the impacts of creatine supplementation and increasing animal protein consumption. And that is a direct quote from the study, right? Increased animal protein consumption and through creatine supplementation, that there's evidence that that can support mood and depression, particularly in women. So this is very interesting for those of you who are going through the perimenopause transition. Perhaps if you're experiencing that sort of change in mood, is to potentially take a look at creatine supplementation for support in that way. But also, again, I would just say like there can be so many reasons why these issues come up. And this is not, I'm not saying this is a Band-Aid solution to all of that, but it could be something worth looking into for yourself. And then lastly, in terms of benefits, cognitive performance and sleep, creatine has been shown to improve cognitive performance and reduce mental fatigue. And then specifically, if we think about women and the interplay of these things, right, there can be some disruptions to sleep quality across the menstrual cycle, for example, or potentially, right, in that perimenopause transition where there's disruption to sleep for several different reasons. So it appears that creatine has some promise throughout the menstrual cycle to help sort of offset some of the adverse effects that can happen to cognition and sleep. And this may be really helpful during periods of high stress and sleep deprivation. So again, could be an area to look into in terms of creatine supplementation. All right, let's take a look now at kind of the last big part here. So we've gone through a lot. We've talked about what is creatine, what are some of the benefits, what are specifically some of the benefits for women. And now let's take a look at just some general stuff in terms of dosing. So again, creatine monohydrate supplementation is considered safe in healthy individuals, but you always want to run this by your medical team before you take any supplement. It's very important that you run it by your medical team who knows your full history and can look for contraindications, for example, that you take a particular supplement. So when we're talking about dosing, this comes up a lot. And a lot of the time it's like people who are experiencing like gastrointestinal upset, or they just are not sure how to take creatine itself. And there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. And I'll tell you the one I typically recommend and I see work better for people. So there's sort of a traditional way of taking creatine, which is called loading. Loading means we're going to take a higher dose for a shorter period of time. And it works out to be about 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. So figure out your body weight in kilograms and multiply by 0.3. And that would be how much you would take for the whole day. But the thing is, you want to divide up that dose into about four equal doses. Okay. So think about dividing that number by 4, and you would do that for about 5 to 7 days. I tend to see that does not work as well for people. It does bump up your cellular stores of creatine much faster. And after your 5 to 7 days, you would go to a maintenance dose to maintain your cellular stores from there. Now, typically when I hear from people who are like, oh, this hurts my stomach, or, oh, it gave me diarrhea or something like that, they're taking like 20 grams all at one time. And so again, we want to make sure you're taking your creatine with enough water. That's one of the reasons why I hear a lot of people say, oh, it causes like upset in my stomach. Well, you need to make sure you mix it with enough water. Follow the dosing instructions on the bottle. That's all I can say there. And then also you may split it up into smaller doses, right? Like I said, 4 over the day rather than taking a huge dose all at one time is a better idea. Now, for most people who are not in a rush to get their creatine stores up really high, I tend to recommend the other way of doing it, which is a routine daily dose. So this is usually about 3 to 5 grams per day. You just start taking 3 to 5 grams per day. And you continue that, and in approximately 3 to 4 weeks, your cellular stores of creatine should be relatively maximized. Okay. And the research on this also agrees that for females, these dosing strategies are also appropriate. So you can just kind of go with what is traditionally recommended. So you've got loading, which I tend to see not work as well for people, but if you're in a rush for some reason, could be your best option, or that routine daily dose, which is again about 3 to 5 grams or 0.03 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So again, take your body weight and multiply by 0.03, or you can just settle for that like 3 to 5 gram dose. And you just start and you just keep taking it. And in about a month, your cellular stores of creatine will be relatively maximized. So there's that. A lot of times people ask, when should I take it? Does it matter? Research is kind of mixed on this. It seems to be that taking it around the time of your workout is the best idea, but when I had Dr. Scott Forbes on the show on episode 365, and we talked about creatine myths, which by the way, you should go listen to that podcast as well. And we'll link it in the show notes. He was like, let's just take it every day. And so that's kind of the rule that I tend to follow is like, I try to take it around my training, but if I forget, or I'm not training that day, I just take it. Okay. So it's not as important, like the exact timing, as it is that you just take it regularly to keep those cellular stores topped up. And if it's your rest day, still take your creatine. Okay. So sometimes I'll see people are like, well, I trained twice that week. And so I'll like, when I'm lifting, I'll take it. But then on the other days, I'm not taking it, which means your cellular stores are not being maximized on those days. So take it as consistently you can, as best as you can. Don't sweat the exact details on timing quite as much. And, just go from there. And of course, with creatine supplementation, just to throw this in there, there is some individual variability. Some people tend to respond really well in terms of seeing a benefit. Some people, not so much. And some people are kind of non-responders to creatine. And that's been shown in the general literature. This review study made a point, or review paper made a point of saying, this has not yet been explored in women, but we're kind of assuming that all individuals, kind of across the board in terms of females may respond a little bit differently. So maybe you are somebody who's a creatine non-responder. Those people do exist in the population, just to say that there is some variability here. So if you feel like you've taken it before and like it gave you absolutely no benefit, I don't know. It's up to you whether you continue taking it. But to me, in my opinion, it's worth a shot. It's worth a shot taking. As I said, always talk to your medical team first and clear it, because you want to make sure that there are no contraindications for taking a particular supplement. I will also throw out there my favorite way to take my daily creatine is with Legion. So Legion has an amazing recharge product. It's marketed as a post-workout, but again, I just try to take it sometime around my training if I can, remember. And so I love that product because it has 5 grams of creatine monohydrate per serving, and it also tastes really, really great. So check that out. You can look into Legion. They have third-party testing and they have transparency and labeling, which is really, really important. And I have seen some pretty shady creatine containing supplements that don't actually list how much creatine is in like a scoop. And so you have no idea how much you're actually getting there. So transparency and labeling is very important. And that's why I really appreciate what Legion is doing. I've been working with them now for 18 months, almost 2 years, and really appreciate what they're doing as a company. And I personally use their products as well. So I've been using creatine ever since I've been working with them and have seen like a really great benefit in terms of my own training. So you can check out my code. I have a code for 20% off your first Legion order. And that code is Steph, STEPH. And if you are just reordering, you get like double points. So go check that out. I also really like that they have an unflavored one where you can mix it into whatever else you're drinking. So it doesn't affect the flavor. But in terms of the flavored ones, I really like grape personally. And I also like fruit punch. Sometimes I'll combine fruit punch recharge that has creatine monohydrate in it with my elements. So that's electrolytes. And that tastes really good. Like raspberry element with fruit punch. I don't know, it tastes really great. So you can check that out. There's lots of different options. You can also just find regular creatine monohydrate powder, like at your local, vitamin shop or something like that. So go check out your options there. But if you're curious about, the quality of what you're looking at, you can always run supplements through labdoor.com and check that out. All right. So we've been a lot of places on this podcast today. We've reviewed what is creatine, what are some of its benefits, what does it do in the body, specifically, what does the literature say for women? And if I could sum it all up, I'd say creatine shows a lot of promise for women. There's still a long way to go in terms of the research, but what we have so far shows that creatine has a lot of benefit for females. So it is something to consider taking. Have that conversation with your medical team. Make sure you clear any supplementation you're considering doing with that team first. And there you go. Creatine beneficial for women in so many different ways. And I then also talked a little bit about the different ways that you can start taking creatine and some of the common questions that come up along the way. All right. I hope this was useful for you. As always, send us a comment here on YouTube down below this video, or send me a DM on Instagram. Let me know what you thought. Are there other questions that you have that I didn't answer that potentially we can talk about in a future episode? Remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform here on YouTube as well, and ring the bell for more notifications. And I will see you on the next episode. Until then, stay strong.